emphasizes really the extreme aspect of this Jewish morality, and that is love your enemies. Don't slice their head off. Don't chase their women and children, right? Throw them off the cliff. That's the good morality of the Aristoi, right? But how did the Jewish and then the Christian feel about it? Hate your body. Value your soul and your afterlife. Don't seek for the pleasures of this life. Instead, be ascetic, right? Give up those attachments to this life and instead value your soul's afterlife once the body is dead. Well, by the way, if you don't believe there is such an afterlife, how do you explain the utility of that kind of attitude? And by the way, that's when we go back into Herbert Spencer and the other British utilitarians. Which ones is he reading? He refers to a lot of British psychologists, and they're looking for the utility of all of this stuff. And what they're they're already in conflict with, is for the British utilitarians, is we want the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the principle of utility, right? And if you're thinking that way, what are you thinking? It's better for people not to have things, not to have hopes, not to have dreams of success in this life. That's the Christian slave morality, where the slave reacts to his position by giving up hope in this life, instead thinking that all the reward comes from my being such a slave in this life, and I will be rewarded in the next, right? This is the slave morality, I think, as Nietzsche is describing it. And as far as he's concerned, that's horrible. The Greek morality was much better, much more like a utility in a sense of evolution. Who's the one that evolves? Well, the Übermensch is, in his mind, an evolutionary next step. And while Star Trek interprets it as not only evolutionarily smarter people and stronger people, considering Nietzsche thought of himself as an Übermensch, and he was very weak and sickly all his life, I'm pretty sure he wasn't thinking in primarily terms of super strength. I think he was thinking primarily in terms of a mental evolutionary step. And that mental evolutionary step is the step that enables an individual to understand how society tries to make a slave out of you. You think of Hegel's dialectical process and how your mind develops and goes through stages. Once you get to the stage of consciousness, the next stage is self-consciousness, right? That's where it seems like you have to have a language, you have to have concepts of yourself. Well, those concepts of yourself are taught to you through your peers, through your language, through your culture, through your state, right? And you think of yourself the way you're defined by your education, by your growth, etc. Well, it's the individuals that reach this kind of Hegelian point where you realize why you think the way you do, and that you've been basically taught to think this way, and you get to that point where you then surpass that and know, like Kierkegaard did. Remember, Kierkegaard's response to this level of development, mental development, was that you have to have a narrative that you can believe in, and so he believed in the Christian faith. That was Kierkegaard's answer. It's absolutely not the way Nietzsche is going to respond to it. Nietzsche is going to instead say that you have to create your own values, like the Greek, Aristoi. You have to be like Achilles, and just decide for yourself what you want to do and impose that on others. And by the way, this brings up an interesting thing, which let me show you Bettany Hughes, because she really does this well. So that's Elizabeth's house, so that's where it's an archive now.
A photograph was taken here which epitomised the extraordinary influence
I don't-
of one of the most provocative and uncompromising
They play too much
figures
with this
of the 19th century.
program that kind of screws up the video.
It's an image of Adolf Hitler standing next to the bust of Nietzsche here in Weimar, where the philosopher lived. With chilling eloquence, this tells us what many Nazis believed, that Nietzsche was the brilliant mind, the inspiration behind the terrifying ideologies of the Third Reich.
I want the rock.
Yet if Nietzsche had been alive to see it, he would have been appalled. His philosophies were being distorted by a regime that stood for so much.
Okay. Sils Maria was where he wrote many of his works.
Nietzsche fell in love at first sight with Sils Maria. Its mountains and forests inspired his most life-affirming ideas. Its beauty reinforced for him the sheer magnificence of existence. And it was on one of his walks here, a month after he'd arrived, that Nietzsche had what he believed was the most important thought he'd ever conceived.
He was walking by this lake when he stopped next to this rock and suddenly had a vision. This was a thought experiment that Nietzsche believed would help us all to analyse every action, every decision of our lives, so that we could live those to the full. This was his question. If a demon were to whisper in your ear that you had to live your life as lived, time and time again throughout eternity, with all the pain and with all the greatness, would you fall to the ground and gnash your teeth and curse that demon? Or would you say that he was a god and that his utterances were divine?
It was an idea that became known as the eternal recurrence of the same, and it formed the very essence of Nietzsche's attitude to life.
So the eternal recurrence, that's assuming that what eventually will be understood as Einstein's, he dies in 1900, Nietzsche dies in 1900, and Einstein's paper is 1904. Einstein's theory of relativity and the first shoot. When's the paper? 1905? So what I mean to say is that Einstein's theory isn't out there available for Nietzsche, but nonetheless, this idea of this eternal recurrence is the idea that everything that happens in time and space has essentially already happened, and it's your consciousness that's kind of replaying the DVD. I think that's how I would interpret it, and so it brings up this issue of, are you capable of changing your life? The trajectory of your life, do you have free will? Can you actually reach a point where you become an Übermensch? By definition, I would argue that every American that's had a level of education that you've had are already in that situation where you have to decide for yourself how you want to live, what you want to do for your future, et cetera, and feel free to make those choices, right? And by the way, you're probably also encouraging others to do the same. You want other people to think the way you're thinking, right? So in the sense of the Übermensch leading the way, that's kind of what you're already doing, I would say, in your mind, right? In the way you make friends and try to encourage others to vote the same way, like the same sorts of things and so on. Value the same things that you value, respect, people the way you feel like you should respect them, and so on. That I think is the next evolutionary step as he's trying to describe it. Remember, at the time that he lived, there weren't very many people that had that kind of education or thought that way. That was a really novel way of looking at things, and when you think of his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, Zarathustra, who is actually Zoroaster, coming down from the mountain, which, by the way, would be the mountain that you saw in that video there, Silas Maria. In fact, he wrote the book in this house.
Two of its four books were written here, in the guest house where Nietzsche often stayed.
It is remarkable being here, isn't it? Because it's in this room that Nietzsche wrote one of his most groundbreaking and influential works.
This is the place where he first had the ideas about Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra is a prophet who comes down the mountain, and he wants to talk to people in a town about this great event, that God is dead, that Christianity, with all its certain universal absolute moral values, is no longer believed in, and that the question of what it is to be human and how one is to live as a human needs to be answered anew. But nobody listens to Zarathustra.
And one of the mechanisms to deliver that is this difficult concept, the Übermensch, the Overman or the Superman. Who or what exactly is that?
Easier to say what it is not. It's not a biological concept. It's not some kind of superior human race. An Übermensch is someone who is no longer reliant on inauthentic external goals society gives him or her, parents, religions. It's someone who is able to commit to goals that you set yourself. You offer humanity goals, and Nietzsche thinks it's a terrifyingly difficult task because the guidelines are missing. There are no blueprints. And while you full well know that whatever task you set yourself isn't universal, isn't good for all, it's nevertheless one you commit yourself to. It's one you strive towards. The Übermensch is someone who can shift and see that the responsibility and the joy of creating life lies not with some transcendent God, but lies within oneself.
In pouring himself into writing Zarathustra,
There's a silly version of the movie here that I thought.
In the face of suffering, but he also began to see that suffering itself was the key to unlocking the elusive secret of happiness.
So what do you think happiness is for Nietzsche?
We traditionally see happiness in opposition to pain, exertion, suffering, etc. For him, that is not the case. It's striving towards something. It's suffering through that great task you set yourself. So just flying up onto the summit of a high mountain in a helicopter will not give you the kind of feeling of happiness that you experience when you have spent 15 days walking towards the summit.
I disagree. Totally. In fact, when I use Google Earth to go to the summit, you could use Google Earth to go to the top of Mount Everest. And I remember laying in bed with a little iPad, falling asleep, and going to Mount Everest.